All right, looks like the recording is started. Thanks to everyone for joining the final working group for both working group meeting for both the uses and sources working groups. This will be a joint meeting and a bit longer than other meetings, but given the interconnections between what both of these working groups are looking at, we think it's worthwhile to make sure that there's some opportunity to look at these things together. Look at these topics jointly between the two working groups. So moving through some meeting logistics real quick. A quick ask again to mute your microphone in order to prevent background noise. If you aren't talking, if you would like to be heard, you're welcome to use the chat box at any time or raise your hand to ask a question. Note that chats or comments in the chat may not be officially captured in the recording, and so we encourage you to speak up whenever possible. On that note, we will be recording this meeting. The recording has already started. You'll be able to access the recording afterwards at Connecticut Green Bank's website. And to make things easier, if you're speaking, please state your name for the records that will be captured in the recording as well. Now, quickly running through the agenda for today's meeting, we'll start as always with welcome introductions so that everyone can get a sense of who's on the call. We'll quickly review the deliverables for each of these working groups as they were identified in the initial working group charters. We'll review some of the key findings that came out of the working groups in pursuit of those deliverables. But the bulk of this time is dedicated to discussing draft recommendations coming out of these working groups, which were incorporated into the draft report that was sent out to everyone last Friday. We're aiming to finalize the report and the associated recommendations in time to send to the legislature on January 15th. And so this is a great opportunity to directly provide feedback on any of the recommendations that are incorporated into the report, because we want to make sure that we have a consensus on what is being sent to the legislature. And then finally, we'll end with next steps. So starting with introductions, my colleague Nina will run down the list of names in the teams group, and when she calls your name, please provide your title and the organization that you're representing. To start, my name is Colin Smith. I am a senior consultant at Stratagen.
Thanks, Colin. I'm Nina Habel. I'm a senior analyst with Stratagen. Next on the list, I see Andrea.
Hi, this is Andrea Labawi. I'm a senior engineer with Toyota in the Washington, D.C. office.
Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Arreston with the Council on Environmental Quality.
Ben.
Hi, this is Ben Butterworth. I'm the Director of Climate, Energy, and Equity Analysis at Acadia Center.
Bernie.
Good afternoon, Bernie Pelletier with People's Action for Clean Energy. Thank you.
Enrique.
Hi, Enrique Bosch. I'm the Director of Corporate Innovation at Avangrid.
Brian.
Brian Garcia, President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank.
Erin.
Hi, everyone. Erin Childs, Director at Stratagen Consulting.
Joel.
Joe Reinville, Director, CCAT.
Kathy.
Kathy Ayers, Vice President of Research and Development for Nel Hydrogen.
Tony.
Tony Leo with Fuel Cell Energy.
Booger.
Uğur Paşaoğulları, Professor of Mechanical Engineering, University of Connecticut.
Lydia.
Hi everyone, Lydia Rupert with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
Sam.
Hi, Sam Danowski, she, her. I'm the State Director of Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter.
Shannon.
Hi everyone, I'm Shannon Lawn. I'm an attorney and the Connecticut State Director for Conservation Law Foundation.
Becca.
Hi, everybody. Becca Treach, Senior Policy Advisor at Connecticut Deep.
Tyler? There's anyone I missed? I think that's all. I think you're good to go ahead, Colin.
Excellent. Thank you, Nina. So going into the next phase of the agenda, looking quickly at working group deliverables, we'll review the initial charters and some developments that occurred since the development of those charters. So starting with the sources working group, a number of the deliverables identified for this working group were designed in collaboration with other working groups. But there were two that I wanted to point out that were specifically connected to this working group. That was the developing a total production potential estimate for clean hydrogen using Connecticut-specific resources developed across at least 3 scenarios, and then developing a scenario-based production curve for clean hydrogen, identifying specifically the amount of hydrogen that could be produced at different price points based on the cost of underlying energy feedstocks. And we'll see a review of the findings from those 2 deliverables later in this presentation. In terms of other deliverables, one was connected to the proposed definition of clean hydrogen. This was meant to be developed in collaboration with a policy and workforce development working group. We reviewed best practices on definitions in this working group, but ultimately the outcome from the policy and workforce development working groups work was that the state agency DEEP would be the most appropriate agency to develop this recommendation, and that's been included in the recommendations in the report. In addition, impact on local manufacturing potential and industry from the hydrogen production scenarios was primarily addressed in the policy and workforce development working group, and then estimates around and comparisons of Connecticut's hydrogen production potential to other Northeast states was also only meant to be addressed if other agencies within the state were not already addressing it, and ultimately it wasn't determined to be needed at this time. Moving forward to quickly look at the uses working group deliverables. These included developing a structured framework to prioritize hydrogen end uses in applications that are relevant to Connecticut, and we'll walk through some of the results from that effort in the presentation. Also developing a total demand size for priority hydrogen end uses, identified through the framework, developed across at least 3 scenarios, which in this case was done by developing a sectoral breakdown of estimated hydrogen demand across the different end uses. Then developing scenario-based demand curves for each hydrogen end use, identifying the prices at which hydrogen would become competitive or reach cost parity with traditional fossil fuels for specific end uses and the expected demand at those price points. And then finally, as appropriate, coordination with DEEP's efforts to develop project concepts for clean hydrogen use within the regional clean hydrogen hub, which was ultimately not required at this time, and so it was not a focus of the efforts that went on over the past few months. I'll pause quickly before going into key findings. See if there are any questions or comments. I unfortunately, I'm not able to see the chat, so if you raise your hand or provide a comment, my colleague Nina will call on you to speak.
And Colin, just to clarify what you're looking from folks, any comments you're looking from folks at this time is just confirming an understanding of sort of what these working groups set out to do at the outset and what ended up happening, and making sure folks feel sort of comfortable with what was undertaken and whether there's any questions about that. Is that fair?
That's absolutely right, Aaron. Better phrasing would have been, are there any questions at this time? All right, well, hearing none, I'll go through some of the key findings. A number of these slides have been presented at past working groups and task forces, and so I won't go through them in detail, but I wanted to quickly walk through a summary of the findings from this report and their connection to the deliverables that were just discussed. So starting with some of the uses working group findings, we developed a prioritization framework for hydrogen end uses, separating end uses into different levels of priority for additional investigation based on the scale of individual industries, the economics of hydrogen compared to other decarbonization solutions for specific end uses, and the opportunity for different end uses to provide both environmental and economic benefits to Connecticut if hydrogen were pursued in those particular applications. Again, I won't spend too much time on these slides, but we'll walk from this hydrogen prioritization framework, which fed directly into the demand analysis, which we'll look at later in the presentation. But first, quickly taking a look at those highest priority end uses and their locations within Connecticut. You can see here a number of, or the highest priority end uses that were identified earlier, plotted within Connecticut to understand, provide a sense of where they are located and also where they are located relative to potential renewable energy production zones or areas where renewable energy feedstocks like onshore wind, solar, and offshore wind could potentially be used to produce hydrogen. Then moving forward into the demand analysis, these focus specifically on the highest priority end uses for additional investigation, which were chosen and looked at specifically because they did have some of the largest potential to drive hydrogen demand in the state over the long term. You can see the results of this demand analysis on the chart here, broken out by sector. On the right, you can see the scale of total demand across all of these different sectors out to 2050, adding around 335 kilotons of annual hydrogen demand to the state by 2050, scaling up from around 25 kilotons in 2030. Just as a reminder, this is meant to be a sort of maximum demand potential for Connecticut, assuming ambitious hydrogen use and transition, an ambitious transition to hydrogen use across all of these sectors. If this ambitious transition were realized, it could add an additional 12.8 gigawatts of fuel cell needs in the states, primarily for use in power generation and long-haul trucking. Next, we plotted this demand on a hydrogen demand curve. So this chart shows the price at which hydrogen would need to, the price point that hydrogen would need to achieve to be cost competitive with fossil fuels that are currently being used in each of these end uses. You can see that end uses that in the transportation sector that use fuels like bunker fuel or diesel tend to have higher cost parity points, meaning that it would be easier for hydrogen to be economic or compete on an economic basis with these particular end uses. Other end uses like aviation and power generation, the economics are more challenging for hydrogen, in particular power generation and industry. Competing for hydrogen to compete with relatively low cost natural gas in the States, it would have to hit relatively low price points or compared to competition with fossil fuels used for transportation. Next, stepping into the supply side, we developed 3 different supply scenarios to identify the technical production potential for hydrogen using resources within or connected to the state of Connecticut. We looked specifically at end uses that were identified in the task force, notably solar, wind, nuclear, and biogas, as well as the potential to produce hydrogen from excess renewable energy that would otherwise be curtailed. These three use cases, I won't go into significant detail about each one of them. They're essentially developed based on different levels of siting restrictions for renewable energy and assumptions around the production potential and availability of renewable energy or clean energy supplies like biogas and nuclear. I will emphasize that in all scenarios, we first allocated enough clean energy to meet Connecticut's general decarbonization targets. So in theory, the supply scenarios outlined here, that technical potential is not in competition with Connecticut's existing decarbonization targets, because the needed capacity that would be required to meet those decarbonization targets has already been subtracted out of these supply estimates.
Colin, you've got a hand from Shannon.
Yes, Shannon?
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question. When you're referring to Connecticut's general decarbonization targets, are you referring specifically to the 2040 zero carbon electricity requirement that was added to the GWSA? And does that also incorporate the other GWSA greenhouse gas reduction targets?
I believe we're primarily referring to the 2040 zero carbon electricity targets. Essentially, what we did is we calibrated the renewable energy need according to what was identified in the Deep Decarbonization Pathway IRP, which I believe was primarily centered around achieving the zero carbon electricity target.
Right, and that was driven by the executive order, which was then later codified. Just to prevent confusion, I would suggest specifying that and also referring to the statutory citations so that people don't get confused with the other GWSA greenhouse gas reduction targets.
Mm-hmm. That's a good suggestion. Thank you. All right, well, moving through to the next slide, unless there are any other comments or questions on this one. So we have here the hydrogen supply curves that were constructed based on those scenarios. And specifically here, we're looking at the mid-production case, although results for the low and high production case will also be included in the report as well. But you can see here that the largest potential for bulk production of hydrogen comes from offshore wind and solar, which can produce hydrogen for potentially under $2 per kilogram in 2030 using IRA tax credits, and then around $3 per kilogram in 2040 with the expiration of those tax credits, but also additional cost reductions that are expected in the underlying technologies. In this last slide, you can see that supply curve plotted against the hydrogen demand curve that was presented in earlier slides. So there's sort of two takeaways, I guess, from this particular view. The first is it shows very clearly sort of the comparison between the technical production potential for hydrogen in and around Connecticut compared to the maximum potential demand for hydrogen in Connecticut. In the blue line, you can see how much hydrogen could technically be produced, and the orange line shows how much hydrogen might be needed. And you can see that the length of the blue line significantly exceeds that of the orange line. The other key takeaway is the cost comparisons. So you can see here that the cost that you can likely produce hydrogen at using existing clean energy resources in Connecticut at the point of production are largely lower than the cost that hydrogen would need to cost to compete with diesel and bunker fuel, which is heartening, but it's important to keep in mind that this LCOH for these renewable energy fuels is specifically the cost of hydrogen at the point of production. Hydrogen would still need to be delivered to end users at hydrogen fueling stations or industrial sites to provide that fuel, that low carbon fuel for these end users. That infrastructure will add additional costs to the final price. And so the key takeaway here is the importance of keeping the cost of that connecting infrastructure low so that hydrogen will still be a competitive option against transportation fossil fuels in the future. For situations hydrogen would be replacing natural gas, the economics are more challenging, indicating that hydrogen use in these sectors may be driven by decarbonization targets and needs for things other than low-cost fuel, for example, the provision of capacity to support situations or futures in which there's a high amount of variable renewable energy on the grid. Finally, I wanted to quickly bring up the discussion that we had on clean hydrogen best practices, specifically the value in moving away from the kind of color-based system for identifying and defining hydrogen towards one with a focus on carbon intensity, which is the important component to make sure that the hydrogen being produced does not contribute to global climate change based on how it's produced. For example, the federal guidance around a proposed clean hydrogen production standard establishes clean hydrogen as one that produces less than 4 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen on a life cycle basis or well to gate. So taking that practice, focusing in on a technology neutral approach that looks at carbon intensity rather than definitions around colors. I'll pause quickly here to see if there are any questions before getting into discussion around draft recommendations.
You have a hand from Ben.
Yes, Ben?
Yeah, thanks. So not to make you flip back to slide 9, which was
Happy to, no problem at all.
the hydrogen prioritization framework, but I'm still confused, and I brought this up at the last work group meeting about the hydrogen blending for non-core customers and how it's falling into the high priority for additional investigation category. Like we talked about at the last meeting, you know, that kind of falls into two kind of distinct end uses depending on what you're talking about, right? If you're talking about targeted blending specifically for power gen and industrial heat customers versus more blanket blending where in essence all customers are going to be receiving the hydrogen blend, including residential and commercial customers. So I would just continue to stress more specificity on what you're actually referring to with that end use. Because those two strategies to me are very different, right? Because if you're talking about widespread blending that's impacting all customers, you know, to me, that kind of falls into that furthest right, other potential valuable applications, right? Because regardless of the intent of the hydrogen blending, right, it's really the end result of what customers are actually receiving in their pipes that matters from an end use perspective.
Right. I definitely recall your comments and thank you for staying on this topic. You're right, they are different end uses. And, you know, in this slide, we don't go into the level of detail that would really be required, I think, to make that distinction. But I can assure you that in the report, we do provide more context on this particular point, though I definitely encourage you to review that report. And if you feel that it is still overly ambiguous, that would be an excellent point to provide more target recommendations on how we can make sure that it's more clear.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I also just, whenever there's a table like this, I'm always concerned that someone who's just flipping through the report and not reading the additional context, you know, just sees that and says, oh, okay, that, you know, that's a high priority, right? So even just like including, you know, a couple words on what you specifically mean in a table like this, I think could also be valuable as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's the constant challenge of balancing conciseness with making sure that slides can stand on your own. But it's a point well taken, and we can work to make sure that it's more clear in the future.
Thanks.
All right, well, please feel free to speak up or raise your hand if you have any other questions as I flip back through the slides, but otherwise, I'm happy to start getting into the draft recommendations, where I highly encourage everyone to provide your thoughts and feedback, because we want to make sure that we incorporate as much feedback as possible on these before they are ultimately presented to the legislature. So starting in on the hydrogen sources draft recommendations, this is one of two slides. This is specifically recommendations for DEEP, which we put on its own slide just because there were more recommendations for DEEP than most other agencies. So walking through these first, we're calling on DEEP to conduct further investigation to ultimately establish a definition of clean hydrogen that will be most appropriate for Connecticut, as identified earlier in the slides. As well as to continue to evaluate the sufficiency of zero-emission electricity resources to meet both electric sector decarbonization goals and hydrogen production needs. This will be an ongoing process as Connecticut continues to develop and move towards goals on both fronts. In addition, calling on DEEP to consider accounting mechanisms that would encourage hydrogen producers to certify the carbon intensity of their produced hydrogen, which would be important both to fit into clean definitions of hydrogen and ensure that in situations where you can't directly co-locate electrolyzers with renewable energy installations, for example, when hydrogen is making use of offshore wind or otherwise curtailed renewable electricity, that it's possible for hydrogen producers to certify that the hydrogen they produce is clean and they can take advantage of federal and any other incentives. Finally, considering investigating additional approaches for expanding clean hydrogen supply within the states, as appropriate depending on the definition of clean hydrogen that is established.
Another hand from Shannon.
Yeah,
Shannon?
thank you. Just a question on the accounting mechanisms. Just the way this recommendation is phrased, I think is a little bit confusing. So it sounds like we're suggesting that DEEP do some information gathering, basically, of what accounting mechanisms would be useful to determine the carbon intensity of different types of hydrogen production. But it's not clear to me how that consideration would then encourage the producers to actually use these accounting mechanisms. So maybe this is splitting hairs a little bit, but I feel like this could be broken down potentially into considering what accounting mechanisms are necessary to determine the carbon intensity. And then the second question would be, well, should there be some requirement that producers actually use those accounting mechanisms?
And I was gonna say, Colin, I'm also happy to jump in here. I know you've put a bunch of thought into this, but I think this also ties into some of the policy discussions. So I'll let you go first.
Oh, no, go for it, Aaron.
Yeah, Shannon, I would say a couple things. I think one, there are a number of things that we have found in this process that from some of the best practices research that we're suggesting as options, but also want to give DEEP the freedom to investigate and see, how this fits into their portfolio of policies and whether this makes sense. So that is first and foremost. Our goal is to provide helpful recommendations, but if folks are finding that hey, this actually doesn't work well for us, or there's reasons that we may not want to do this, giving some freedom to be evaluating that. I think second, to your point, accounting and tracking is the first step in this process. And accounting and tracking sets you up to do and consider a whole bunch of other policy options. So, Colin talked previously about some of the gaps, the compensation gaps, and we've seen other states that are talking about, how does policy close out those gaps? Are there market mechanisms or market approaches that can close some of the cost effectiveness gaps? But these accounting mechanisms are really the starting place for a whole variety of conversations. And so, the way that we're viewing this is this is a good place, thinking about this and thinking how this fits into policies is a good place to get started. And as that investigation goes forward and as stakeholders are able to kind of participate in those conversations, that may open a number of other doors, but given where we are right now in the process, we didn't feel like it was appropriate to ask folks to go walk through those doors at this time. So I don't know if that provides helpful context on how we've been thinking about this one in particular and sort of some of the broader arc of policy here. Please feel free to tell me if that does not make sense.
No, I get the hesitation in being too prescriptive with recommendations, which I think is kind of already covered by just making it a recommendation to consider this. I might just suggest maybe rephrasing a little bit for clarity.
Okay, that's helpful.
Excellent. Any other hands or chat comments before I move forward? Well, then I'll jump on to the next slide, looking at recommendations from for the sources working group connected to other state agencies as well as interagency recommendations for PURA, given their role in the state's in setting rates and tariffs for electricity within the state. We recommended for them to consider whether existing renewable energy, flexible and/or interruptible load tariffs could be applied to electrolytic hydrogen production, or if there would be a need to develop a specific electrolytic tariff to take advantage of the specific cases and kind of characteristics of this source of load. Next, for DECD, looking at evaluating the need for additional funding for the brownfield loan and grant programs to help meet the clean energy needs of the state and the land requirements for these clean energy developments. In the interagency section, calling on DEEP and DECD to continue maintaining the Connecticut Brownfields inventory as a resource for potential developers to identify prospective project sites. This would include looking at potentially communities that are eligible as energy communities under the Inflation Reduction Act. And then DEEP and DECD joining forces again to continue supporting development of clean energy projects on brownfield sites and for projects that have community support and or have completed a community benefits agreement. Any hands or comments in the chat?
I don't see anything, Colin.
All right. Well, in that case, we can move through to the first set of hydrogen uses draft recommendations. Again, this first page is looking specifically at recommendations for DEEP. In this case, there are 5. The first one, consider further investigation, the possibility of focused policy and market development support for clean hydrogen use in the highest priority end uses, which were identified in the slide earlier in this presentation. Also, further investigation into high priority hydrogen end uses to look into the possibility of coordinating supporting measures for these end uses with other hydrogen efforts, such as the ones identified above for highest priority end uses. Exploring market-based approaches to incent reductions in carbon intensity of fuels for mobility end use applications, as well as identifying and potentially expanding clean transportation incentives to include other identified end uses like on-site port equipment or hovercraft or ocean-going vessels in collaboration with other state and federal agencies that would be relevant to that efforts. And then finally, investigating the need for hydrogen fueling stations to support multi-sector mobility applications in coordination with Connecticut DOT to develop strategies for optimizing siting and funding for fueling stations to support these applications.
Got a hand from Andrea.
Yep.
Hi, thank you. I'm trying to figure out how to word this question. So we're talking about the highest priority end uses, but when we were going into sources, we found that the kind of price of hydrogen to achieve cost parity is actually lowest for 2 of the 3 of your highest priority end uses, which is aviation and what was the other one? Power generation. So if you only want to produce hydrogen, clean hydrogen for the highest priority end uses, and that is the lowest cost, I don't think you're ever going to get there. You need to encourage clean hydrogen production for any use in order to bring the cost down so that it reaches the price that's necessary to expand the highest priority end uses. So I'm trying to figure out how to flip that from being backwards to forwards. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I think so. Just to maybe repeat back in a slightly paraphrased way, because some of the end uses that were identified as highest priority also had challenging economics for hydrogen, that there should be a focus on reducing hydrogen cost specifically in line with the cost that we required to economically use hydrogen in those applications.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the ways that you reduce cost is by encouraging production volume. And not limiting the production method. So so just limiting the production of clean hydrogen only to the highest priority end uses seems a little bit counterproductive. And I'm not sure that's what you meant to imply by this first bullet.
Certainly not what we meant to imply. The thought here was that the highest priority end uses are end uses that can really drive a lot of the scale that it's you just correctly identified as being important to drive down cost, as well as end uses where there's a high likelihood hydrogen will be required just because there aren't really economic alternatives. We are certainly not excluding the use of hydrogen in other end uses. And there's definitely a recognition that those other end uses could also contribute to the demand for hydrogen in the state. They just weren't assessed because the economics for hydrogen in those use cases are still, developing as cost for hydrogen and batteries change over time. And so that there's less certainty about the level of demand that they would provide. In addition to the fact that a number of those end uses, particularly in the high priority buckets, are a bit smaller scale. And so the contribution to the overall demand wouldn't necessarily be as significant. But we're certainly acknowledging, and perhaps not as directly as we should be, that hydrogen could be used in those other end uses, especially as costs come down to become more economic.
Yeah, and I think the subtlety is that this recommendation is on the uses recommendation and not on the sources recommendation. So your focus is market development of the highest priority end uses, not necessarily market development of clean hydrogen. So I think that's maybe a subtle thing. But thank you for your discussion. I think that clarifies things for me.
No problem. Is there an adjustment you would recommend either for this recommendation set or the sources recommendation set to make that more clear?
Maybe in the sources slide, you talk about trying to figure out what mechanisms can bring down the cost of hydrogen. And then for this one, it would make it easier for me to just delete the clean hydrogen use in, because I think that's implied. What you're trying to do here is develop the highest priority end uses. And the hydrogen demand will follow from that. maybe is what would make it a little bit more clear.
Well,
Just off the top of my head.
I see. I definitely take that note on the sources item, and we can investigate how to incorporate that in the uses as well, while still creating some clarity around making sure that the recommendations are tied in some sense to the prioritization framework, since that was definitely one purpose of having the prioritization, the framework, to help inform some of the recommendations.
Great, thanks, Colin.
Colin, it looks like you've got a couple more raised hands.
Excellent.
Sorry. Yeah, from Tony and then Bernie.
Starting with Tony then.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Did you estimate, and this is kind of along the same lines, you have estimates of the hydrogen demand for the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 highest priority demands. Did you estimate the demand for the lower priority ones? And the one in particular, and this came up earlier, is the gas blending. Unfortunately, Connecticut uses a lot of natural gas, and we wish it didn't, but it does. And it seems like you could drive a lot of volume as you started to do gas blending. And did you estimate what that demand might be?
No, because that was identified as not a priority end use at this time, mainly because it was unclear what the competition, the economics would look like compared to electrification. And I think that's going to be an ongoing question in the state over time. I know that there's an effort to address at least some of that question in the update to Connecticut's comprehensive energy strategy. But at this point, hydrogen use for residential commercial heat specifically, that the economics didn't seem like they were settled enough with electrification to be able to recommend that as a high priority end use. But you're right, similar to light duty vehicles, it could be a significant demand for hydrogen if the economics came out on the side of hydrogen being a financially advantageous fuel to use in that case.
And you've got sort of two blending cases. Do I understand that one is you're blending everybody's gas, and then another you're just blending gas for certain types of customers?
Yes. So the first type of, I guess the blending for commercial and residential customers would necessarily require blending into the entire gas grid because it's a very distributed end use. For blending for industrial and power generation customers, for non-core customers, there is opportunity to directly blend hydrogen at those sites because they're more concentrated and use high levels of gas on sites. And that would be sort of the first order use of that, first way to look at using hydrogen in those situations, because it would require less of a study on the full distribution system to see what the system could accommodate in terms of hydrogen blends. But to Ben's point, you could, in theory, also blend hydrogen into the larger gas system, and it would be received by non-core customers as well as core customers. And I believe that was his reason for raising that question beginning, which is that these two end uses are different, need to be clarified exactly what is being talked about there.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, it's Bernie Pelletier from PACE. I'll make the point. I was somewhat encouraged by Andrea's comment, although I don't think this is what she was necessarily getting at. But I think the reason for being of hydrogen in the very first place is that in an all renewable electric generation world, predominated by solar and wind, there'll be a lot of variability. That variability will be hourly, but it will also be seasonal. So there'll be many months of the year where the renewable grid overproduces. And so therefore, you would like a carrier or a storage mechanism to take October's overproduction and use it in February when we'll be underproducing in this future 2040 world. So I make that comment because I think that is the foundation on which all these other uses stem from. If one was to make hydrogen just to make hydrogen, it never makes sense, because production of hydrogen is at best a parasitic process. If you're going to have solar and wind making electricity, you should use it as electricity unless you can't use it as electricity. And therefore, to produce it, to inject it into a natural gas pipeline would be simply to inject an economic loss into that pipeline. So, again, I'll just say that I think this hydrogen economy makes sense as a seasonal carrier, and on that as a foundation, all these other uses can take advantage of that infrastructure. I don't know if that made sense. I don't see any evidence of that line of thought in either the sources or the uses discussion, but I think it's somewhat of a unfortunate omission.
Colin, if I might chime in here, because I think Bernie, you're providing some broader comments about like why are we here and why are we doing hydrogen and what is it really all about, and why are we, what's the point of all this? And I think something that we've been acutely aware of in this process is that if we are proposing to the state and the people of the state to be investing in hydrogen and investing in hydrogen infrastructure, we need to be doing so because and only because we think there is some real value that can be created from this investment, and that investment can create benefit for the residents of the state, and we might even say for the world writ large, right, as we think about some of the imperatives around climate change. And so that has been very much at the forefront of our minds, and I think has been showing up especially in this conversation in the uses working group. So I want to thank everyone for being willing to engage so deeply on some of these foundational questions. But when we were putting this together, and when Colin's been really leading the charge on thinking about uses and our high priority uses, that has been really core to our thinking, making sure that we're proposing investment in areas that we think will create benefit and will do good. We are also simultaneously balancing the fact that I think has come up a couple of times, which is that hydrogen is a resource where costs come down with scale, and where there is an opportunity to create some market acceleration, but that market acceleration has to be done in line with all the things that I just mentioned about the overall objectives and the value of investing in hydrogen. And we've been, I think, and Colin has been doing, I think, a really wonderful job in this work group, kind of balancing some of those different perspectives. And so I just want to maybe stand up and say, we hear you. We're hearing the points that are being made from all kinds of folks about both being really pointed about what we are trying to do with hydrogen, and also thinking about the broader scaling and growth of this industry and what that looks like, and trying to identify places of balance where we can do both of these things and do them in a way that's smart and lines up with state policy and the state's needs and objectives. So I definitely want to, we do very much want to hear from folks if some of these specific recommendations are not pointing us in that direction. And I guess just reiterating that is very much our goal here, and we are very open and welcoming to comments about how we can specifically update or tune the recommendations that we're putting together to be in line with that. So sorry, Colin, for interjecting there, but I wanted to make sure that was very clear to everyone. And I do want to continue to encourage folks to stand up and provide us some suggestions about how we can do better.
Okay.
No problem, Aaron. And I guess maybe to expand on that and speak specifically to Bernard's points about the inefficiency of using hydrogen in places where electricity could be used directly. That's one of the guiding principles, I'd say, behind the prioritization framework in terms of the economic case for hydrogen across different end uses, and identifying highest priority end uses being situations in which it's not necessarily possible or economically feasible to use electricity directly. and in this way avoiding a situation in which hydrogen is being produced to provide a service that, or produced from electricity to provide a service that electricity could have provided, and seeing how what level of scale could be driven from those end uses specifically.
Colin, one more hand from Kathy.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that the other side of that coin is clear too. I 100% agree with Bernie that it doesn't make sense to take baseload solar, make hydrogen out of it, and then put it back through a fuel cell. However, there are also, if we're going to decarbonize the economy, there are demands for hydrogen that are there regardless. So if you're going to decarbonize transportation, you're going to need hydrogen, whether it's for synthetic fuels or directly. If you're going to decarbonize agriculture, you're going to need to make ammonia. And that is a baseload on the hydrogen side that is going to need grid support. And we want the power for that to be renewable. So you are going to have some baseload wind and solar that's going directly to make hydrogen and is not excess. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on that it's going to have to be this optimized balance of the two.
Thanks, Kathy. Those comments are helpful. And wanted to check in to see if there's any other comments or questions on this front. And maybe drilling down a bit more, because I know we moved into other topics there that were not a bit removed from the recommendations that are specifically on this slide. I want to make sure that we return to the recommendations here and see if there are any comments or concerns about the wording or the relevant agency that's being identified, or any sort of more technical questions there.
I see another hand from Andrea.
Hi, sorry, I know you just asked for specifics on your post, but I had another comment that I wanted to talk about from an abstract or a higher level conceptual, because I was sitting in on the policy and workforce last time, and we talk about defining clean hydrogen and how it has to have a certain level of cleanliness, and some people are weighing in that they don't want to support hydrogen that uses this or has this process. But I'd like to overlay upon that the fact that I get the sense that some people feel like if it's not zero carbon, or if it's not below 2, or if it's not below 1 or whatever, it's not worth doing at all. And I'd like to push back against that kind of underlying assumption that it feels like you're working on, because the current status of transportation and the current status of electricity is not zero carbon. So anything that reduces carbon, especially the sooner that it can be done, I think is worth doing. And that's the value of these kind of certification processes. So understanding the carbon intensity, because as the carbon intensity reduces, you can increase the amount of incentive. But I'd like to encourage you to avoid the assumption that if it's not clean, it's not worth doing. If it is an improvement, it's worth doing. And I don't know exactly how to change the wording on these particular bullet points. It's just something I've been absorbing over the past 3 or 4 working group meetings that I'd like to just put into words.
Thanks, Andrea. And Colin, if you don't mind me chiming in on this one as well. And I think, this has been an important point that's been made throughout the process. And I think, the points that you're raising about how this sort of relates to other decarbonization solutions and the pace at which we're going, and really how we're thinking about getting started in this journey. All of those pieces super duper valid, and in fact a large part of why we're recommending that DEEP continue to look into this because there is so much depth and complexity to this conversation. And we want to make sure that whatever decision ends up being made for the state, that syncs up with all of the other policy activities that are going on for decarbonization of transportation end uses and everything else. So I think, and Colin, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we are trying to do justice to some of the diversity of stakeholder perspectives and opinions that have come in on, clean hydrogen definition and sources, and we're trying to represent those stakeholder perspectives in the report, so that there is a record of some of these opinions, but we are not in this process recommending a specific definition, but rather are saying, hey, this needs to be priority for the state, and this has to be synced up with all of the other great work that DEEP is doing.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. And I also recognize that this this report isn't the end; it's almost the beginning of the process.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the recommendations here try to identify areas in which there will be a continuation past this process. The clean hydrogen definition is a very good example of such a situation. But thank you. I didn't mean to discredit or discourage people from providing high-level commentary by asking for a focus on the recommendations. I just wanted to make sure that we had clarified any more focused concerns before moving into other discussion topics. But we absolutely have time here to discuss all of these topics, and I encourage all sorts of commentary and any sorts of feedback you would like to put on the record. But unless there are any other hands in the chat, I can go ahead and move past this slide and look at the second set of recommendations that we have for the hydrogen uses working group. A number of different agencies identified in this set, as well as some interagency options. First, for the legislature to consider tax exemptions for hydrogen vehicles and critical facilities that produce or use green hydrogen or clean hydrogen. And evaluating broader policies that would ensure the decarbonization of hard-to-electrify sectors, such as long-haul trucking, aviation, shipping, industrial processes, and a number of the applications identified as highest priorities for hydrogen use and really looking into what would be required to decarbonize these particular sectors, so that hydrogen as a potential decarbonization source can be effectively supported. For Pura, looking at potentially evaluating the role of hydrogen fuel cells for critical backup power and peak power generation, and identifying approaches to incorporate recommendations on using either of these two tools in appropriate planning venues. Then in interagency efforts, DEEP and Pura could consider promoting the use of hydrogen end uses that are currently commercially viable through existing clean energy programs. Specifically for Pura, consideration should include how any changes would affect the program's existing objectives and cost effectiveness. And then for DECD and OPM, looking at and identifying opportunities for tax incentives or programs to support Connecticut's industry-leading hydrogen fuel cell manufacturing sector. Is there any commentary on the wording of any of these recommendations, the agencies that are identified as the actors, or any other comments generally connected to this or other topics?
Hey, Colin. So we've got two hands, first from Ben and then from Shannon.
All right, starting with Ben.
Yeah, thanks. I just recommend a lot more specificity in that first bullet. When you use the term hydrogen vehicles, I mean, that's about as broad of a term as you could possibly use there, right? And we have an entire hydrogen prioritization framework, right? And we have different vehicles falling into all three buckets of the prioritization framework. So I'd like to see that bullet aligned with the hydrogen prioritization framework. So kind of stressing, tax exemptions for the highest priority hydrogen vehicles in that bullet. I think that wording is pretty critical there, because right now this basically looks like kind of considering blanket tax exemptions for any sort of vehicle that could use hydrogen.
Thanks, Ben. Shannon, following on with your comment.
Well, Ben basically made the point I was going to make, but just to add to that, I wanted to go on record that my organization would not be supportive of a tax exemption for light duty hydrogen vehicles. And I mean, in part, right now we do not have a tax credit for electric vehicles, although we do have the cheaper rebate program for which both electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are currently eligible. So I agree with Ben's recommendation to align this recommendation with the priority end uses. And then secondly, just a question on potential incentives or programs to support the fuel cell industry. Not to push back too much on this one, but I'm just wondering, given the mature and thriving state of that industry in Connecticut, I'm wondering whether it's necessary to have such incentives and what informed that recommendation. Because it seems like it's doing well already without them.
Well, I know we have a number of, oh, sorry, Aaron.
I was going to say, let me, I can chime in on some of the thinking behind this, and then I am sure that some of the fuel cell industry folks on this call may also have perspectives that I think would be helpful to hear from. But I think I would say that this one has been primarily motivated by some of the workforce development conversations. And I think, specifically, at least from us taking a step back, Connecticut's hydrogen and fuel cell industry is extremely impressive compared to where other states are at. And there's been a lot of conversation about the fact that we are expecting to see hydrogen investments accelerate nationally and globally, and that there's a real opportunity for Connecticut to be, really realizing a lot of the benefits there, especially as we think about the kind of workforce development opportunities. And so wanting to think about how Connecticut can position itself well to continue to be in that leading position, as many states are thinking about how they establish their own manufacturing capabilities. So I'll just say that on some of the thinking behind the fuel cell manufacturing discussion, but certainly would welcome perspectives and opinions from folks in that industry. And Shannon, do we answer your questions, or did you have any other questions following up on that?
No, I think that covered it. Thank you.
Okay. Colin, one more hand raised from Tony Leo.
Yeah, well, one question. I'm curious why someone would support tax exemptions for heavy duty hydrogen vehicles, but not light duty vehicles, when you consider with the sheer number of light duty vehicles in the state, there's a tremendous potential demand there. And it's the same application. I get it. I get that infrastructure needs to be sort of rolled out, but one of the things people point out is that the value proposition seems better for heavy duty than light duty. That would argue for the tax exemption to go to the light duty to sort of levelize that playing field. So I think light duty vehicles in general are getting sort of a short shrift these days in the hydrogen discussion, which I think will change with time, but that's my perspective. And also, as a member of the fuel cell industry, yeah, we do have an impressive industry in Connecticut. It is not yet profitable. And so, as we expand, anything the state can do to keep our fuel cell industry, not just my company, but others in the state, I think is a good thing to do.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate you putting those comments on record.
Okay, we've got another hand coming in from Kathy.
Yeah, just to add to Tony's comments, I think we are one of the leaders in the hydrogen and fuel cell industry today, but there are tons of startups and companies jumping into that pool. And so if we want to remain the lead in these areas, we also need to continue to support those industries in Connecticut.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Kathy.
Kat. Thanks, Kathy and Tony. Just want to say thank you both for stepping up to provide comment. Okay, I am not seeing any other hands raised. But now is a good time to raise your hand if you have some other comments to provide. Okay, Colin, back to you.
All right. Well, the next part of the agenda is next steps. So if you have any other comments or think of anything else, as we went through this next recommendation, I'm happy to jump back to past slides. That's certainly not something to be shy about asking for. But looking at some of the next steps, as a reminder, in terms of where we are in the working group meeting schedule, this is the final working group meeting for both the uses and sources working groups. This week and the previous week saw the final working group meetings for all working groups in the initiative, and today is actually the last working group in general. Going past today, we're looking at some of the upcoming task force milestones. As I mentioned, the report, the draft report that these recommendations were pulled from, was sent out on Friday, last Friday. I highly recommend you take some time looking through it. Especially in regards to the working groups that you've been involved with throughout the process. The recommendations that were presented as part of this presentation were pulled out of that report and presented directly in interest of brevity, but there's a lot of additional context and analysis and in many cases information and background provided on these recommendations in that report that will likely provide a better sense of how they were developed and what specifically they're referring to. So we encourage everyone to take a look at that report. If anyone needs it sent out again, I'm happy to send it directly if you'd like to send me an email. But we're aiming to have all feedback from stakeholders and participants back at noon Eastern time this Friday, December 23rd, which will give us time to start incorporating that feedback in to distribute a final report text to the full task force on January 6th, in time to for the task force meeting on January 10th, where we'll be voting out the final report and looking at identifying recommendations to send to the legislature on January 15th, or identifying that the recommendations are ready to be sent to the legislature on January 15th.
Thanks, Colin. And we've got a hand raised from Shannon.
Shannon?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to include this comment in my written comments, but just wanted to raise a couple of issues since this is our final meeting. One area I think I have reviewed the report. I think on the whole it's well done, but there were a couple of issues I wanted to flag that I think we could do a better job of identifying where we are currently. So I know the report is really forward-looking and how Connecticut should be moving forward in developing a clean energy economy. But I think that we could use some more clarity and specificity with kind of the current state of the hydrogen ecosystem. So specifically, I wanted to recommend that we clearly identify with percentages and with like a visual, some kind of graph, how hydrogen is currently produced, because that's not clearly laid out in the section laying out the different methods of hydrogen production. It doesn't quantify like what percentage of hydrogen currently is being produced by these methods. And I think that's really important for legislators and other decision makers to know. just to have a sense of like what the landscape currently looks like and what we're trying to move towards. So I wanted to make that recommendation. And then relatedly, it does kind of rank the different types of hydrogen production by the average emissions intensity, but that those numbers are not actually included. So I would recommend that we actually include the average emissions intensity of each production method, just to make that clearer for readers of the report. And I'll include those comments in writing as well. I just wanted to get that on the record in this working group meeting.
Of course, no problem. Just to follow up, when you say the hydrogen production sources are ranked by emissions intensity, you're referring to the renewable energy feedstocks as well as nuclear and biogas?
Yeah, there's like a table that has them. There's like an arrow on the side that shows like most emissions intensive to least emissions intensive, but there are not actual like values attached to that. And I'm suggesting that we add the average emissions intensity for each of those production methods. So just inserting that into the existing table.
Got it.
And then for the different types of hydrogen production, including like, X percentage of hydrogen is currently produced using this method, and then providing like a graph to show that visually.
Okay. That's helpful feedback. Thank you.
That one might be a little hard, just because there's so many different uses for hydrogen and they each have their different production methods. So if you're just looking it up over all hydrogen molecules that are produced, you're going to find a lot that's produced for the petrochemical industry. So they clearly don't have the same priorities in their production methods. But if you look at hydrogen for transportation, for instance, if you reference California, you'll find that the production methods and the associated carbon intensity is far, far different. So I recognize that might be, it's a simple request, but it might be difficult to explain. It might be difficult to answer.
Sorry, are you suggesting that it should be broken out by different types of end uses? Because I was just suggesting that like the total amount of hydrogen produced be, for example, like you can find data on like this percentage is currently produced by steam methane reformation without breaking it into the end uses.
I just don't see where that has any value, because the hydrogen that's currently being produced by the petrochemical industry is not really being considered to be used for any of these purposes that we're discussing in this report.
But I think Shannon's saying, I'm not sure the legislators are aware that, say, whatever the percentage is, the majority of hydrogen is currently made from natural gas and coal gasification, and showing them that pie chart that shows like less than 1% is currently made from electrolysis of water, and less than like 4% is made from electrolysis generally, maybe just provide some perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Like this is the current state of production, and then this is what we're trying to move towards. So I think that's helpful context for legislators who probably don't have a lot of familiarity with hydrogen.
Thanks, Shannon, Andrea, and Kathy. I think a helpful discussion there, and I think we'll look into how we can incorporate some of this feedback.
Yes, appreciate you providing that feedback, Shannon, and also still encourage you to provide that feedback directly on the report, just to ensure that it's represented. Are there any other comments or feedback at this time? Definitely, this is not your last opportunity to provide feedback. I know that was a lot to take in, and that you may appreciate some time to reflect before providing more detailed commentary, but wanted to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to speak their piece as part of this presentation before, otherwise ending the presentation a little early and maybe giving you back some time in your days.
I do want to add on to Colin's comment, which is that this is not the last opportunity, but we are closing in on some of our final opportunities to provide feedback on the report itself. So definitely, if folks have thoughts or perspectives, really want to get those out as soon as folks are comfortable or have those thoughts have coalesced, so we can make sure we're getting them into the report. Now is a great time. Email is a great time. Reaching out directly, all good, but we are getting into the final stretch here, everyone. So please do speak up. I'm going to take the lack of comment from everyone as a sign that everyone would love to get 13 minutes of their day back. Unless anyone wants to chime in. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for all of the input and participation through this process. I know these work groups in particular, I think have been grappling with some of the most challenging parts of what we've been talking about here in terms of thinking about sources and thinking about uses and how those line up with some of the state's policy goals and objectives. So just wanted to, as we get to our final work group, just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone for showing up to these meetings, having some really healthy dialogue, getting some good diversity of opinion. Big thank you to Colin for leading this process and bringing folks together and getting such great work put in front of everyone to be a foundation for our conversation. But just really appreciate it. We really could not do this without all of you showing up and helping us out. So thank you. Okay.
Yes, want to echo Aaron. Thank you all for your feedback and continued participation. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your week and good holiday season.
Thanks, guys. Well, thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, all. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good holiday.
You too.